1984, sisters Lily and Wileen Kennedy lived in a small blue and white house in the Heights area of Houston, Texas. Wileen was an interior decorator who focused on stained glass decorations. She also sold old-fashioned clothes and jewelry. Lily used to work with data but was out of a job. After a rough divorce, she moved in with her sister on East 12th Street, wanting to keep her new address secret from her ex-husband. On March 5th, 1984, just a few days after Lily moved into the home, the girl's 63-year-old father Jack was waiting for them to pick him up to drive him to a doctor's appointment at 8 a.m. When neither of them had arrived at his house by 8:30, he became worried and decided to walk over to their home. When Jack arrived at the small house, the door was slightly ajar. He made a terrible discovery. The bodies of his daughters were on the floor of the living room, lying head to foot in a row. Lily had been shot once in the head. Wileen, however, had been raped and stabbed 4 times in the neck, which led the police to believe that Wileen had been the killer's intended target. The murders did not seem like a typical random act of violence. There were no signs of forced entry, and nothing aside from Lily's wallet had been stolen from the house. Wileen's wallet, which contained several $100s, along with her valuable jewelry inventory, had all been left behind. The house had been ransacked as though the killer had been looking for something. Police found unknown shoe prints at the scene, but no fingerprints that could lead them to a suspect. A neighbor reported to the police that she had been awoken at 6 a.m. by 2 loud noises that may have been gunshots. Shortly after 6 a.m., another man who lived in the area was getting ready to leave for work when he saw a man walking down the street carrying a bundle made out of a quilt. He confronted the man, thinking that he might be a burglar. The man claimed that he had just gotten into a fight with his girlfriend, and he had just gotten kicked out of the house. He had hastily shoved his belongings into the quilt on the way out. The neighbor accepted the story, and the man walked off. The neighbor met with a sketch artist and helped develop a composite image of the man he had seen. Given the fact that Lily's divorce had just been finalized the Friday before she died, and she was afraid of her ex-husband, he seemed like a viable suspect. However, at the time of the murders, he had been in the hospital recovering from back surgery. Wileen also had been threatened by an on-again, off-again boyfriend, but he passed a polygraph and was not identified by the neighbor, who had seen the man near the crime scene in a lineup. He was eventually cleared as a suspect. The case eventually went cold. In 2009, the Houston Police Department Homicide Division's cold case unit re-examined the evidence from the case, hoping that modern technology would provide a lead. From Wileen's rape kit, they were able to develop a DNA profile. Unfortunately, there was no match to the profile in Cody's, so police were still unable to identify the killer. In 2014, Houston Police Sergeant Paul Modard received a phone call from a defense attorney who told him that he had a client with information about the murder. The informant was in prison in Indiana at the time and refused to give his information over the phone, so Modard traveled to Indiana to meet with him. According to the informant, shortly after Wileen and Lily's murders, a friend had shown up at his home in an agitated state, going on about 2 sisters and how hard it was to kill someone. He pulled a bundle made up in a quilt, like the one the witness had seen a man carrying near the scene of the crime out of his car. The man then smashed a gun with a hammer in the informant's yard and started a fire, in which he threw a woman's wallet, a knife, and other items. The informant went with the man as he buried the remnants from the fire and the quilt in a drainage ditch. The man who had come to the informant's home that day was named Edmund Beauregard Deegan and still lived in the Houston area. Outside of the times he had spent in state prison, it was largely unclear how he spent the 30 years since the murders, as he mainly worked odd jobs in construction that did not leave an employment record. Pictures of him from 1984 closely resemble the sketch of the strange man seen near the crime scene the morning of the murders. Deegan met with Sergeant Modard and admitted to knowing Wileen Kennedy. He had a wholesale used clothing business in the early 80s and had crossed paths with her in connection with her own clothing business. He said that he had last seen her a week before her death. He denied ever having any sort of sexual relationship with her. He voluntarily provided a DNA sample, which turned out to be a match to the profile extracted from Wileen's rape kit. On January 14, 2015, more than 30 years after the Kennedy sisters were killed, Deacon was arrested and charged with capital murder. The prosecutors were concerned about going to trial, however, even with the DNA evidence. They did not have physical evidence tying Deacon to Lily's murder, and feared that trying him for both murders together would create reasonable doubt. They decided to offer him a plea deal, in which he would only have to plead guilty to Willeen's murder. On February 20th, 2017, Deacon pled guilty to Willeen's murder and received a sentence of 15 years. While this seems like a short sentence for such a serious crime, the actual time Deacon will spend in prison will in fact be even shorter. Under a Texas mandatory release law that applies to anyone convicted of murders that occurred between 1977 and 1987, Deacon will automatically be released from prison in 2024 instead of 2030. Since he had remained in custody since his arrest in 2015, he was eligible for parole just 5 months after his sentencing. Lily and Wileen's niece, Jackie Elliott, launched a media campaign urging members of the community to write to the parole board, discouraging Deacon's release. He was not granted parole and remains incarcerated. What do you think about it? Tell us your thoughts in comments below. Let's continue. Before we proceed, I've got an exciting surprise for you. We've launched a brand new channel dedicated to intriguing content such as old historical mysteries, cold cases, and particularly chilling horror stories perfect for bedtime. Drop a comment letting us know if you're a fan of horror stories or not. You can find the link in the description below. Let's find out who will be the first to explore it. Alright, let's dive back into the video. Timothy Coggins was a fun-loving and outgoing 23-year-old in 1983. He was known to be a good dancer, and he was very close with his 5 siblings. He could strike up a conversation with almost anyone he met. He was last seen alive on the night of October 7th, when he went out dancing at the People's Choice Club in Griffin, Georgia. On October 9th, hunters discovered Timothy's disfigured body discarded near some power lines in the nearby town of Sunnyside. Timothy had been stabbed 30 times and dragged down the rural dirt road behind a vehicle. His injuries were so extensive that police could not identify him based on his appearance, and his family had to give him a closed casket funeral. The overkill involved in his murder led to fears that Timothy's death was meant to send a message. Tim had recently begun dating a white woman and had reportedly been socializing with another white woman at the People's Choice Club the night he was last seen. These were still dangerous things for a black man like Tim to do in that area of suburban Georgia at the time, something his ride to the club that night had warned him about. There were a few leads discovered. Tim had reportedly been last seen with white men in a gold compact car, and a potential suspect was identified. However, Tim's case was not a high priority to Sheriff James Freeman, and resources were quickly diverted to more trivial crimes like vandalism and stolen mailboxes. Clint Phillips, who was the lead investigator on the case in 1983, described these attitudes and actions in court under oath in 2018. Tim's case had gone cold almost immediately, and Phillips had to close it after just a few months. Over half of the evidence collected at the scene would eventually disappear. It would be 34 years and 4 days before any arrest was made in Tim's case. On October 13, 2017, 5 people were arrested in connection to the case. Bill Moore Sr., 58, and Frankie Gebhardt, 59, were charged with murder, felony murder, aggravated assault, aggravated battery, and concealing a death. Gregory Huffman, 47, was charged with obstruction and violation of oath of office. Lamar Bunn, 32, and Sandra Bunn, 58, were both charged with obstruction. Moore and Gebhardt were brothers-in-law, and Sandra Bunn was Gebhardt's sister. Lamar Bunn was Sandra's son and Gebhardt's nephew. Moore and Gebhardt were the only 2 individuals charged with crimes directly tied to Tim's death. The other 3 individuals were accused of crimes committed long after the murder, carried out to help cover it up. Lamar Bunn was a part-time police officer who previously worked for the Lamar County Sheriff's Office and who, according to his arrest warrant, instructed Gebhardt on how to prevent having his DNA collected, and met with other members of law enforcement in an attempt to prevent the collection of evidence in the case. Sandy Bunn was alleged to have instructed her brother on how to obstruct and prevent the collection of evidence. Gregory Huffman was a Spalding County Sheriff's Office detention officer, accused of revealing the name of a confidential informant being used against Gebhardt. Following their arrests, Lamar Bunn was placed on unpaid administrative leave pending an investigation, and Huffman was fired. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation had reopened the case based on reports that Gebhardt, who was the one potential suspect identified in 1983, was bragging about the murder in prison. He was boasting to other inmates about how he and his brother-in-law had protected the white race from black people by killing a black man, although he exclusively used a racial slur that will not be repeated here to describe him. Gebhardt has numerous white supremacist symbols tattooed on his body and was an outspoken that limited the rights of African Americans that the local government was trying to have taken off the books in the early 1980s. The white woman Tim had been socializing with on the night of October 7, 1983, turned out to be Gebhardt's girlfriend. The report of Gebhardt's statements in prison prompted GBI agents to re-interview witnesses, many of whom said that they had been threatened into silence by Gebhardt in 1983. The renewed interest in the case in turn spurred even more eyewitnesses to come forward, and over 60 people were eventually interviewed by authorities. Gebhardt had apparently been very proud of his crime, and his involvement in the murder was apparently common knowledge, although fear of Gebhardt and his threats of violence kept the community quiet. One of the witnesses had been just 10 years old when he heard Gebhardt describe the gruesome crime in detail. Physical evidence, including a chain, a knife, and a shoe, was found thrown inside a well on Gebhardt's property. On June 26, 2018, a Spalding County jury found Frankie Gebhardt guilty of malice murder, felony murder, aggravated battery, aggravated assault, and concealing the death of another. He was sentenced to life in prison plus 30 years. Bill Moore was scheduled to go to trial later in 2018 on the exact same charges. But after Gebhardt's conviction, he agreed to a plea deal. The Coggins family was consulted about the deal and agreed to its terms. On August 16th, Moore pled guilty to volunteering manslaughter and concealing the death of another. He was sentenced to 20 years in prison plus 10 years of probation and will be eligible for parole. Judge Fletcher Sams placed an additional condition on the plea deal, barring Moore from ever returning to Spalding County or any of its surrounding counties should he ever be released from prison. Told CNN that she was close enough to Moore in the courtroom to speak to him at his sentencing. "I told him that what he did to our family 35 years ago tore our family apart," she said. "Our grandmother went to her grave not knowing what happened to her son. I said, 'We forgive you. I hope that whoever you pray to, you ask for forgiveness and are forgiven.'" Marcia Carter moved from Canton, Ohio to California with her husband and 3 sons in 1979. Within a few years, however, she and her husband divorced. By 1983, 25-year-old Marcia was living in the city of Richmond and had a 4th child, a son she did not share with her ex-husband. The single mother managed to work as a purchasing agent for a manufacturing company to support her children, attend college, and sing in a rock band. Marcia's oldest sons, Dante, 11, Travis, 9, and Antoine, 7, saw their mother for the last time on the night of Tuesday, December 6th, before they went to bed. When they woke up the following morning, their mother was not in her bedroom, but a large pool of blood was. The frightened boys ran to get help from a neighbor, who came back to search the apartment. The boys' baby brother, Andre, who was just days away from his first birthday, had been hidden under the bed, unharmed. 10 days later, Marcia's 1975 Mercury Monarch was found in the parking lot of a hotel in West Sacramento. Her body was inside of the car's trunk. She had been stabbed to death. Marcia's case went cold, but was reopened in 2008. Blood evidence found on a piece of Marcia's clothing left behind in her bedroom was sent to the Contra Costa County Crime Lab. But there was a severe backlog of evidence so the samples from Marcia's case were not tested until 2016. When they were finally tested, they revealed a blood DNA profile belonging to the man Marcia's sons had always believed killed their mother. In September 2016, Sherelle L. Smothers was arrested and charged with Marcia's murder. Smothers and Marcia had previously dated. According to Marcia's sons, he did not take the end of their relationship well, and leading up to the murder, He had been waging a campaign of harassment against the family. He would smash windows at their apartment and make threatening phone calls. He would show up at the apartment, and Marcia would have to tell him to leave them alone and slam the door in his face. Marcia warned her sons to run if Smothers ever got close to them. When he was arrested, Smothers was confined to a wheelchair. He had been driving in a Corvette in 1988 when he was rear-ended by a drunk driver. He was hit with enough force to flip his car and was left partially paralyzed. He filed a lawsuit against General Motors after the accident and was awarded $6.1 million. He used some of this money to post his $1 million bail and remained out of custody while awaiting his trial. In addition to the blood evidence found in Marcia's bedroom, Contra Costa County prosecutors also had a witness who ultimately testified at trial that Smothers had tried to hire him to kill Marcia for $500 in 1983. He had recorded some of these conversations. Smothers had shown the witness a map of Sacramento and pointed at locations where Marcia's body could be dumped. One of those locations was the hotel where Marcia's body was eventually located. By the time this man came forward, he was suffering from stage 4 lung cancer. He apologized to Marcia's sons for failing to come forward sooner. At the end of Smothers' trial, it took the jury only 3 hours of deliberation to reach a verdict. The reading of the verdict was delayed when Smothers failed to appear in court to hear it. A bench warrant was issued and he was arrested and brought to court so that the verdict could be read. He was found guilty. After Marcia's death, her 3 oldest sons had gone to live in Oakland with their father. When he had difficulty supporting them financially, they were sent back to Ohio to live with family members. They spoke at Smothers' sentencing about the impact there had on their lives. We definitely wanted to say our piece to the court, how this affected us, the negative residual effects that have happened, Travis Carter told the court. We're all doing much better now. We've become very successful individuals and businessmen. But it wasn't without a lot of pain, a lot of tears, poverty growing up, a lot of things that you don't want your kids to go through. Marcia's sons grew up sharing her love of music. They say it helped them cope with her loss. And Dante grew up to be a rapper. During his statement at Smothers' sentencing, Travis Carter also attributed their ability to handle Marcia's death to their faith. We believe that we'll see her again, he said. That's the positive part we take of our faith. What do you think about it? Tell us your thoughts in comments below. Let's continue. Before we continue, 90% of you haven't subscribed to our channel, so if you like this video, please subscribe. It motivates us to make more content for you. Okay, let's continue. Wednesdays were always busy at the Spectator offices. This weekly newspaper in Joliet, Illinois had to finish its newest edition by Wednesday night to be ready for printing on Thursday morning. On Wednesday, September 25th, 1957, Molly Zilko arrived at work at 7 a.m. and ended up working for almost 17 hours, just a bit longer than her usual workday. Molly's role at the paper was a bit hard to pin down. She started as the secretary-treasurer, focusing on the business side of the newspaper, but over 21 years, she took on more and more tasks involved in producing the paper. She frequently wrote articles for the paper and spent a lot of time investigating stories. Nothing made it into the Spectator without Molly approving of it, and she demanded perfection in the proofs she was presented with. After a long day spent talking on her private phone line and examining and approving page proofs for the new issue of the paper, Molly finally left the office at 11:27 p.m. Molly had finished almost all of that week's issue of the paper before she left the office. All she had left to complete was the front page, which she planned to handle first thing in the morning when she arrived back at the office at 6 a.m. Instead, Molly herself would end up being the new issue's front page headline. At 5:15 a.m. the following morning, 2 printers arrived at the Spectator office and called Molly to wake her up, as they usually did on Thursdays. She did not answer the phone. When she did not arrive at the office by 6, as she normally did to get the paper ready to print, they drove to her home on Buell Avenue, just a 3-minute drive away. When they arrived, Molly's black 1955 Chrysler was parked in front of the apartment. Her car keys were under the seat, where she typically left them. One of the shoes Molly had been wearing the night before was on the trunk of the car, and the other was found in the grass nearby. The printers called other staff members and 2 of Molly's siblings. The group got a locksmith to come out and let them into Molly's apartment on the second floor. There was no sign of Molly inside. It did not appear that her bed had been slept in the night before, and the jewelry she had been wearing the previous day was not found inside the apartment. The police were called. The investigation quickly turned up a few clues. Neighbors reported hearing muffled screams, as well as the sound of a car speeding down the street sometime around midnight. They all had attributed the noises to rambunctious teenagers. The shoe had been on the trunk of the car because a man walking down the street at 12:15 a.m. had seen it on the ground and picked it up and placed it there so that its owner would find it. Based on the times of these two accounts, whatever happened to Molly had happened very quickly. Molly had previously told friends and family members that if anyone ever came after her, she would take off her shoes and try to run, leaving the shoes behind as a sign that something had happened to her. While it seems unlikely that Molly would have had time to take off her shoes while trying to flee and attack her, Molly did habitually drive without her shoes on. If she had been attacked as soon as she got out of her car, she would not have had her shoes on and could have thrown them on the ground to leave as a clue. Molly's disappearance became a major news story, in part because her co-workers at the newspaper made it so. Reporters from across the Midwest traveled to Joliet to cover the case as well. The air and ground search for Molly spanned 5 counties. Local motorcycle riders and hot rod drivers searched the back roads of Joliet. Waterways were also searched. Despite the media coverage and the thorough searches, Molly Zilko remained missing. 1910 in Joliet. Both of her parents were Slovenian immigrants, and when her father Frank became a United States citizen a year before her birth, he had altered the spelling of the family's surname to make it seem less foreign to native-born Americans, as many immigrants did at the time. Molly's first name was Americanized as well. Her legal name, as it appears on her birth certificate, was Amalia. She would, as an adult, sign her name to official documents like her will and passport, as it appeared on her birth certificate, but she publicly used the more common name Amelia. However, her full first name rarely mattered, as most people called Amelia by her preferred nickname, Molly. At the age of 17, Molly had gotten a job as a secretary at the law practice of William McCabe. McCabe would be a fixture in Molly's professional career, and she would remain fiercely loyal to him. The 42-year-old was a lawyer by the time he hired Molly, but he had started out his career as a reporter in 1903 and had worked for several newspapers. McCabe was also heavily involved in politics. He had served 6 terms as an Illinois state representative and then as the mayor of Lockport, Illinois for 2 years. In 1932, he was elected Will County State's attorney and made Molly his office manager. In June of 1936, McCabe decided to get back into the newspaper business after he lost his bid for re-election as state's attorney. He bought The Spectator, a weekly newspaper in Joliet. That December, he made a deal with Molly. He offered her the position of secretary-treasurer of The Spectator, a position which would pay her $20 a week. Her main responsibility would be to ensure the paper's finances were built on a solid foundation. If she achieved this goal, she would be given 33 shares of Spectator stock. Molly received these shares at the beginning of 1945. On April 7, 1948, William McCabe, who was again running for public office, was beaten with baseball bats and left for dead along a rural road by 4 attackers. He was not found for several hours. While he survived the attack, he was plagued by pain and health problems for the remainder of his life. This left him unable to be as active in the day-to-day operations of The Spectator. With McCabe out of the office much more frequently due to his injuries, Molly took on more and more of the responsibilities of the newspaper. While Molly had been a major part of The Spectator, it was at this point that she became the main driving force behind it. Molly received 15 more shares of stock in the paper in December of 1951. In 1953, she and William McCabe established a trust agreement. They each held 48 shares of stock in The Spectator and gave 3 additional shares to state's attorney Frank Masters to hold in trust. In the event that either Molly or William passed away, Masters was to sign the 3 shares over to the surviving member of the agreement, which would give them controlling interest in the paper. Given William McCabe's advanced age and poor health, he was expected to pass away long before Molly, making the trust agreement essentially his way of making Molly Zilko his heir apparent as far as The Spectator was concerned. The attack on McCabe resulted in Molly being much more involved at the paper, and it also resulted in Molly getting involved in investigations that made a lot of dangerous people unhappy. Molly believed that her longtime employer and business partner had been attacked by members of a local crime syndicate. Joliet was plagued at the time by political corruption and organized crime. Just before McCabe was attacked, The Spectator had run several articles about the illegal gambling operations the syndicate operated in the area. Molly believed that McCabe had been targeted because of the attention he had brought to the illicit operation and not for political motives. Molly would use The Spectator to voice her opposition to corruption and organized crime right up until her disappearance. She publicly denounced the minor punishment Joliet's mayor received for failing to pay taxes on kickbacks he had received. She figured out how to record phone calls and had several contractors fixing bids on city projects on tape. She banned the wife of suspected gang leader Francis, the Thin Man Curry, from the paper's society pages and would copy down license plate numbers from cars parked outside the Curry home while they were having parties. She reported heavily on local illegal gambling activities and the failure of police to shut them down. Gambling and its ties to organized crime dominated much of Molly's work at The Spectator just prior to her disappearance. Francis Curry's organization controlled the distribution and operation of pinball machines in Joliet. A Supreme Court ruling had also just declared that pinball machines were to be considered gambling devices. Molly therefore wrote editorials supporting city council candidates who wanted to ban the machines in Joliet, as well as the legislation itself. The city council voted to ban pinball machines in August of 1957, with the ordinance going into effect the following January. That same month, Molly focused in on an illegal gambling establishment operating out of an area warehouse, sending reporters and a photographer to investigate it. The attention resulted in the establishment having to close down. It reopened 2 weeks after Molly went missing. In short, there was not a shortage of dangerous people who would have been happy to see Molly Zilko disappear. While Molly publicly showed no fear in her writing, refusing to back down in her coverage of corruption and crime, she did often fear for her safety. She frequently suspected that she was being followed and once called one of her brothers because she thought someone was waiting to attack her in the parking lot outside of the Spectator offices. He drove over and sat in his car in the parking lot with a shotgun to watch her as she walked to her car, in case she had been right. Molly's office window had also previously been shot at. However, a mob-related abduction or politically driven crime is not the only possible scenario in Molly's case. It has been considered that Molly may have voluntarily disappeared and left her shoes outside her apartment to make it appear as though she had been abducted. Molly normally had the press room foreman follow her on the short drive home when she left work late at night. On the night she went missing, she did not ask him to, which further added to the speculation that she had left on her own accord. Given the concern she had about her safety, it would not have been unreasonable for her to leave town and start a new life, as her own personal version of the witness protection program. After Molly's disappearance began receiving publicity, numerous possible sightings of her were reported around the country. By the summer of 1958, FBI offices in a dozen cities across the country had followed up on alleged sightings of Molly. None of these sightings were ever substantiated. Molly was also allegedly spotted overseas, but her passport had expired in 1953, and she had never applied for a new one. It was also suggested after Molly disappeared that she had less than honorable reasons for wanting to leave Joliet. Molly did own several luxury items, like mink coats and expensive jewelry, that seemed too expensive for someone with Molly's salary to purchase. When she went missing, she was wearing a diamond ring and a bracelet that was worth $5,000. She also owned a 17.5-carat diamond ring that had reportedly been exhibited at the 1933 World's Fair and was valued at more than $30,000. This led to rumors that Molly had been embezzling money from the Spectator and had run off to live on the stolen money she had hidden in a secret bank account. However, when William McCabe's daughters, who did not like Molly or the amount of influence she had of the Spectator, took over operations at the paper in Molly's absence, their first order of business was to order an audit of the paper's finances, which showed no missing funds or discrepancies. At least some of Molly's expensive jewelry had reasonable explanations. The diamond ring Molly had been wearing the night she disappeared is rumored to be the engagement ring she had been given as a young woman. Her fiancé had been killed in an accident and Molly never married anyone else. Molly had also only paid $5,000 for the 17.5 carat ring because she had purchased it from an estate. Molly also only paid $55 a month in rent for her second-floor apartment. She barely furnished it since she spent so much time at work. This would leave a larger portion of her salary available for discretionary spending. While all of the money she had to spend on expensive items isn't necessarily accounted for, there is no evidence of gross financial misconduct on her part. With local authorities having no luck in finding Molly, her friends and family began putting pressure on the FBI to get involved. One of Molly's brothers organized a petition which received more than 5,000 signatures, imploring the FBI to take up the case. William McCabe wrote J. Edgar Hoover personally, arguing that the FBI's involvement was necessary because of the corruption going on in Joliet and Molly's advocacy against it. Publicly, the FBI refused to take on the case, claiming that there was no actual proof that Molly had been abducted or that any other federal law had been broken, which would have been necessary for them to have authority to investigate the case. Covertly, however, the FBI did in fact show an interest in Molly's case. They pulled tax returns for Molly and her associates, checked for secret accounts in dozens of banks, and followed up on and discredited several reported sightings of Molly. By January of 1958, with no more leads and no evidence that any federal statutes had been violated, the agent in charge of the FBI's office in Chicago wrote to J. Edgar Hoover, asking for permission to end the Bureau's investigation. Hoover insisted that the case remain open and would deny all further requests to shut down the investigation. For more than a year and a half, Hoover was skeptical of the authorities in Joliet, of the local crime syndicate of the Zelko family, and of Molly herself. While Hoover believed there were a lot of leads for the Bureau to investigate, none of them located Molly or proved that a federal crime had been committed. Molly's disappearance also caught the attention of future presidential candidate Robert F. Kennedy. In 1958, Kennedy was the chief counsel for the Senate Rackets Committee and came across Molly's case while investigating organized crime's involvement in the coin machine industry. Kennedy came to Illinois to interview James Rinna, a mob enforcer serving time in prison for, among other things, threatening a newspaper editor who had been reporting on criminal ties to pinball machines. During his meeting with Kennedy, Rinna confessed to being involved in Molly Zilko's kidnapping and claimed to know where she had been buried. Kennedy and his investigator went to the farm Rinna had identified as the site of the burial and dug for Molly's remains themselves, but found nothing. Rinna later admitted to fabricating the story in hopes that Kennedy could get his sentence reduced. In 1978, reporters Lonnie Kane and John Whiteside published a series of articles re-examining Molly's case. In the course of their investigation, they uncovered two new major witnesses in the case. One of them was a bartender, who may in fact have been the last person to see Molly before she disappeared. According to the bartender, Molly had come into the private club where he worked and had a drink on the night she vanished. She left him a 50-cent tip and asked for $4 and change. She then made at least 2 long-distance phone calls from a phone booth and left. The phone records from that day had long been destroyed by the time Keene and Whiteside heard about this account, so there was no way for them to confirm it or investigate the people Molly had called. The bartender's story does fill in a gap on the timeline of Molly's final night. Her apartment was just a 3-minute drive from her office at The Spectator. Molly left the office at 11:27, and Molly's neighbors heard screams around midnight. If those screams came from Molly as she was being abducted, and she was abducted as she got out of her car to go into her apartment, then there was almost a half hour of time that would be unaccounted for, during which she could have stopped at the club for a drink. The second witness was a woman who insisted that she remain anonymous, and was given the pseudonym Sarah in Kanan Whiteside's coverage of her account. In September of 1957, Sarah lived on Stryker Avenue in Joliet, across the street from a construction site where a storm sewer pipe was being put in. At 1:30 a.m. on September 26th, an hour and a half after Molly Zilko's suspected abduction, she awoke to the sound of a car and got up to see if it was her husband arriving home. Sarah claimed to have seen 4 men get out of a dark car with Michigan license plates. They took something long and wrapped in a blanket out of the trunk of the car. Sarah then saw a woman's limp leg fall out of the blanket. The men buried the woman in the ditch that had been dug for the pipe before driving off. At least one of these men worked at the construction site, and Sarah saw him bulldozing over the area the following morning. This man was one of many who worked at the site who would come over to Sarah's house to ask for water. When this man came to ask for water that day, he asked Sarah if she had slept well the night before, and she feared that he had seen her witness the burial from her window. Sarah agreed to be hypnotized under the supervision of a doctor. The doctor believed that she was being truthful and that she had experienced a traumatic event the night Molly Zilko went missing. Kane and Whiteside were also able to confirm that there had been a storm sewer pipe construction project on Straker Avenue in September 1957. The Will County State's attorney did not find Sarah's statements convincing. Sarah had waited 21 years to come forward and was not an ideal witness. Since Kane and Whiteside cannot reveal her identity, they cannot provide exact details as to why, but they have described her as having personal problems and strange beliefs. An exhumation of the area would have been very difficult and expensive, and as such was never carried out, since it would have been done solely based on Sarah's account. John Whiteside passed away from cancer in 2005 at the age of 61. Lonnie Kane maintains a Facebook page dedicated to Molly's case and is currently working on both a book and an 8-part podcast about her story. Molly's longtime mentor and business partner, William McCabe, died less than a year after she went missing. In 1959, Molly's shares of The Spectator were sold to McCabe's widow Ada for $51,000. The paper's popularity and success began to diminish, and the McCabe family sold it 4 years later. The Spectator went out of business in 1965. Molly Zelko was legally declared dead in 1964. What do you think about it? Tell us your thoughts in comments below. Let's continue. The story of a Long Beach John Doe is tragic from start to finish. At around 4:15 a.m. to 4:30 a.m. on June 3, 1978, the body of a teenage boy was found lying down on Division Street, close to the intersection with Corona Street in Long Beach, California. Given his youthful look, those who discovered the body immediately knew he was a teenager. First responders arrive at the scene minutes later, and at first they believed that the boy was yet another victim of a drug overdose. However, when he arrived at the medical examiner's office, his body told another tale. He had been strangled before being callously thrown onto Division Road. The report detailed that he was between 5 feet 7 inches and 5 feet 11 inches. He'd been found wearing a blue t-shirt, blue jeans, brown belt, and blue and white Red Wings running shoes. The word paid had been stamped on his hand, although the ink had faded significantly by the time he was discovered. Investigators believe that the paid stamp had possibly originated from a bar or club in the area. A medical examiner estimated that he was between 5 and 19 years old, although the lower end of the estimate was favored. In the days after his death, nobody came forward to claim him, and investigators took to calling him Long Beach John Doe. It was thought at the time that vicious serial killer Randy Kraft may have been responsible. Kraft operated just a mile from where John Doe was found, but Kraft was quickly ruled out as a suspect. The investigation into John Doe's identity and the identity of his killer continued, but the investigation went nowhere. The Long Beach Police Department never forgot about Long Beach John Doe and vowed to solve the case. And in 2022, Othram, the savior of cold cases and unidentified person gaze, stepped in to help investigators solve this case once and for all. According to Othram, quote, badly degraded and chemically damaged skeletal evidence was sent to Othram Labs in Woodland, Texas. The skeletal evidence had failed prior attempts, but Othram was able to develop a suitable DNA extract for testing. Once a DNA sample had been sequenced, genealogists were able to track down possible relatives of John Doe. In September 2022, the FBI, Othram, and local law enforcement held the press conference everyone had been waiting for. The Long Beach John Doe was finally identified as 15-year-old Kenneth Nevada Williams of La Puente, California. La Puente is just an hour away from Long Beach. Kenneth's family never reported him missing, and he was last seen in La Puente in 1978. His sister Roxanne Jones told ABC News that Kenneth ran away sometime in 1978. He was never reported missing because his family assumed he'd run away to start a new life. She told ABC, quote, he wanted to live in the city and go to clubs and have fun. He wasn't into drugs or anything like that. But bright lights, big city. Fox News reported that Kenneth had last attended the Fairgrove Academy School in October 1977, a year before he ran away. Investigators are now working to find the person who did this to Kenneth so that justice may be served. What do you think about it? Tell us your thoughts in comments below. Let's continue. On March 20th, 1980, officers with the New York State Police were called out to one of the most horrific scenes of their lives. Residents at the Hudson View apartment complex in Fishkill, New York, had noticed a strange travel trunk close to one of the apartment's dumpsters. Concerned, they contacted law enforcement, who arrived at the scene to find the body of a headless, handless woman inside. Her head and hands had been strategically removed to prevent identification. According to newspaper reports, the body had also been drained of blood, and the scene was noted to be clean. The Dutchess County Medical Examiner's office believed that the remains belonged to a woman in her mid-20s who was around 5 feet 5 inches, 140 pounds with dark brown hair. She had been completely nude in the trunk, and her body may have been cleaned before being placed inside. Unfortunately, the New York State Police would become accustomed to finding the decapitated bodies of women in New York throughout the 1980s. It was a common discovery. Investigators didn't know where to start with this case. Without a head, it would be challenging to create a composite image of the victim. Missing persons reports were cross-referenced, but in most cases nothing stood out and the victim remained unidentified. The media took to calling her the Duchess Jane Doe and pushed for her identity. Be discovered. The case quickly went cold, but it wasn't for lack of trying. The New York State Police and other agencies worked diligently to uncover her identity, but it proved impossible. In 2022, the FBI and the New York State Police partnered with Othram Labs to finally resolve this case. Her case had previously been added to NAMAS, but these leads went nowhere. In May 2022, Arthur isolated possible relatives of Duchess Jane Doe and alerted the New York State Police along with the FBI, who were able to talk to these people and obtain a direct DNA sample. By May 26, 2022, the New York State Police announced that the remains had been identified as 44-year-old Annelle Palpadaro Blake of New York City, 2 days before her body was discovered, May 18, 1980, and it is unclear why the two cases weren't connected. According to friends, Anne was last seen leaving the Vidal Sassoon salon, where she worked on 168th, 5th Avenue in Manhattan, at around 6 p.m. The trunk where Anne's body was discovered was tracked down to a woman named June Leaf, who told investigators that she had last used and seen the trunk in 1960, and after that, she'd lost track of it. Investigators are unaware of any possible connections between June and Anne. What do you think about it? Tell us your thoughts in comments below. Let's continue. On June 22, 2019, Eugene Joe, age 73, went hiking on the Mount Waterman Trail in the Angeles National Forest, California, with some friends. During the hike, they stopped for lunch. However, as they continued, they noticed Eugene was missing. Unable to find him, the group contacted search and rescue. The Los Angeles County Sheriff's Office and rescue teams from across California joined efforts to search for Eugene. 75 individuals broke off into 11 teams to scour the San Gabriel Mountains looking for him. After a week of being lost in the wilderness, Eugene was found down a ravine in Devil's Canyon by members of the Altadena Mountain Rescue Team around 11 a.m. on June 29th. He was able to hear members of the search team talking with a group of campers. Despite being in a weakened state, Eugene was able to use what strength he had left to turn himself over and yell for help. He was airlifted out of the area by a Los Angeles Sheriff's Department air rescue helicopter. Eugene was taken to Huntington Memorial Hospital in Pasadena. He had not suffered any major injuries during the time he had been lost in the forest. His hiking boots, however, were in much worse shape. Eugene was weak, however, because he had not eaten anything in 5 days. He had quickly made sure to find a water source soon after getting lost. which probably saved his life. He had spent the week he was lost drinking water from the Devil's Canyon Creek and slept on rocks at night to keep warm. Eugene was discharged from the hospital the same day he arrived there. Eugene was thankful to have been rescued and grateful for all of the effort total strangers had put into finding him. He does not plan to continue hiking in the future. What do you think about it? Tell us your thoughts in comments below. Let's continue. 35-year-old Amanda Eller worked as a yoga teacher and a physical therapist. She lived in Haiku, an unincorporated community on the island of Maui, with her boyfriend Benjamin. On the morning of May 8, 2019, Amanda was meditating as Benjamin left for work at 7:30 a.m. She was not home when he returned from work, and she did not come home that night at all. Benjamin reported her missing early the following morning. Amanda's white Toyota RAV4 was found in the parking lot at the Macawell Forest Reserve at 9:50 a.m. on May 9th, the same morning she was reported missing. Her keys had been hidden under the front tire of the vehicle, and her cell phone and wallet were inside of it, along with a pair of flip-flops. Amanda loved nature and was an avid runner, so it would not have been unusual for Amanda to have visited this location on her day off from work. It was initially assumed that Amanda had entered the forest around 8 a.m. on the morning of the 8th, based on eyewitness reports of a woman matching Amanda's description being in the parking lot around that time. This timeline came into question 5 days after Amanda went missing, when Amanda's parents, who had flown into Hawaii to help look for their daughter, received a phone call from their pet sitter. A Mother's Day package had just arrived at their home in Maryland from Amanda. Surveillance footage was eventually found of Amanda in a store purchasing the final items for the package at 10 to 11 on May 8th. She was wearing the flip-flops that had been found in her vehicle. She had printed off the label for the package at home and dropped the package off at the post office approximately 10 minutes after she had checked out of the store. The Maui Fire Department spent 3 days diligently searching for Amanda, but their official search was called off after 3 days, as was their procedure. Amanda's family, however, continued searching for her on their own, thanks to the $77,000 they received in donations on GoFundMe and a massive outpouring of support from volunteers. During the course of the search, helicopters and drones searched for Amanda from the air. Divers searched nearby waterways, and volunteers and teams of search dogs searched on the ground. An average of 100 people searched for Amanda each day. On May 24th, 17 days after Amanda entered the forest, a volunteer helicopter pilot was just about to turn back after a search flight because he was going to run out of fuel. He received an instruction over the radio to make a wide right turn, which would take him over an area that had been outside of the official search area, near the Kailua Reservoir, roughly 5 miles north of where Amanda had parked her vehicle. When he did, the volunteers on the flight with him spotted Amanda lying in a creek bed. Amanda was airlifted by the Maui Fire Department to Maui Medical Center, where she was reunited with her family. Amanda had lost 15 pounds and was suffering from severe sunburn, numerous bruises and cuts, and a broken tibia sustained after a 20-foot fall. Amanda was discharged from the hospital on May 26th to finish her recovery at home. According to Amanda, she had planned to spend a few hours in the forest on a 3-mile run, so she decided to hike instead. She stopped to rest and meditate on a downed tree just off the trail at what she thought would have been the halfway point of her hike. When she got up to continue on, she believed she was heading back towards her car. She was not. Eventually, Amanda realized that she was no longer on the hiking trail, but on a board trail that was taking her further away from the parking lot. She tried to use her intuition to make her way back, but got more and more disoriented instead. Amanda had previously read a book on native Hawaiian plants, which helped her identify what fruits she came across were edible. There had been several days where she had been unable to find any food at all. She had come across a creek about a week into her ordeal, which she traveled along so that she would be near a source of water. Amanda had heard helicopters fly overhead almost 20 times during her time in the forest, but the vegetation was too thick for anyone in the helicopters to see her trying to get their attention. At a press conference on May 28th, Amanda described her time in the forest as spiritual boot camp and spoke of her experience largely in terms of the role her spirituality played in it. Some people interpreted these statements to mean that Amanda had intentionally gone off the trail as some sort of spiritual journey. Amanda filmed a video released on the Facebook page that had been set up to coordinate the search for her to clarify what had happened and give the detailed account of how she had gotten lost. She had simply been too focused on the spiritual lessons she could take away from the time she had been lost, rather than on the factual details of her experience at the press conference. Amanda acknowledged that it had been irresponsible to go into the forest without her cell phone and apologized for potentially putting members of the search parties in danger by getting lost. She also thanked everyone who had been a part of the search effort and expressed gratitude for the outpouring of support she and her family had received from all over the world. Amanda's family has plans to use the remaining money raised through GoFundMe to install wilderness cameras in the Makawao Forest Reserve and other remote recreational areas on Maui to help speed up any further search and rescue operations. Amanda's father, John, is also planning to help develop an app for search and rescue workers through his company, Insight Mobile Data. What do you think about it? Tell us your thoughts in comments below. Let's continue. Jesse Galganoff, age 22, was a citizen of both Canada and the United States. He hailed from Montreal but pursued his higher education in the United States. Jesse graduated from Wesleyan University in May 2017 with aspirations of attending medical school to become a neurosurgeon. Although he had been accepted into the Sidney Kimmel Medical College at Thomas Jefferson University in Philadelphia, he decided to take a one-year break before starting. Jesse requested and was granted a deferral to focus on intensive medical education during his travels. In the summer of 2017, he worked 3 jobs to fund an 8-month journey through South America and Asia, spanning from September 24, 2017 to May 15, 2018. Jesse planned to tour South America in the fall and then kick off his time in Asia with a friend's wedding in India in early January. He had a plane ticket back to Montreal booked for May 15, 2018 so that he could spend time with his family before he moved to Philadelphia to start medical school that July. Jesse's mother, Elisa Clayman, drove him to the airport on September 24th. Jesse took a flight to Toronto, where he connected for a flight to Lima, Peru. For the first few days of his trip, Jesse was in constant contact with his family and friends and was active on social media. On September 28th, Jesse sent his mother a text message, saying that he would be out of contact for a few days. He was going to be on the Santa Cruz Trek, a popular backpacking route through the Cordillera Blanca Mountains that typically took hikers 4 days and 3 nights to complete. Elisa expected to hear from Jesse on October 2nd, but no messages came. She initially assumed that he had needed extra time to complete the trek. After a few more days with no word from Jesse, however, she became worried. Jesse was normally very conscientious about keeping his mother appraised of his whereabouts and soothing her concerns about his safety while he was traveling. When Jesse had hiked the Adirondack Trail with some of his friends, he had hiked up alone to a higher altitude to try to get cell service so that he could text his mother and let her know that he was okay. Since Jesse was an adult, Elisa still tried not to panic. On October 7th, she saw a charge on her credit card from the family Apple account. Jesse had spent $1.99 on an app used to track expenses. This purchase reassured Elisa, who assumed that it meant that Jesse was somewhere with a Wi-Fi signal and he was just too busy to talk to her. When another week went by with no contact from Jesse, however, Elisa could no longer sit by and wait to hear from him. On October 14th, she called Apple and asked if it would be possible to trace where the charge on the 7th had been made. After several calls and transfers, she learned that Jesse had purchased the app not on October 7th, but on September 28th, before he left for the mountains. The charge to the credit card had been delayed due to a technical issue. Elisa then called the Canadian Embassy to report Jesse missing. She had to file a missing persons report with her local police in Canada before his case could be brought to Interpol, and she also had to report his disappearance to the FBI because of his dual citizenship. On October 17th, Elisa was in Peru. Elisa was able to make this trip, due in part to a $100,000 donation made by prominent Montreal businessman Mitch Garber and his wife Anne-Marie Boucher to the effort. The couple made the donation because their son was a good friend of Jesse's from school. This donation would be the first of many made by people all over Canada and the United States to a fund created to aid in the search for Jesse. The fund is managed through the Missing Children's Network. When she arrived in Peru, Elisa was initially unable to learn much more about Jesse's movements than she had already known. On September 28th, Jesse took an overnight bus from Lima to the city of Juarez, 400 kilometers north of Lima. He had previously booked a place to stay in a hostel there, but ended up staying in a different hostel. For several weeks, this was the last place anyone knew Jesse to have been, because of a Snapchat he had sent to a friend from the hostel. Elisa tried to use Jesse's devices to further track his movements. She attempted to get information from Apple because Jesse used an iPhone, Amazon because Jesse had been downloading books to a Kindle, and T-Mobile because they were Jesse's cell phone service provider. None of them would comply with the request because of privacy concerns. Elisa had to wait for the authorities in Peru to issue subpoenas compelling them to release the information they had. 3 weeks after Jesse went missing, Apple and Amazon both released information they had on Jesse's accounts. T-Mobile claimed that they were having difficulty gathering the information because Jesse had been roaming internationally. Little progress seems to have ever been made in finally getting Jesse's cell records, despite Elisa's ongoing efforts. A judge has also executed an order on other carriers to see if Jesse's phone connected to any networks other than T-Mobile around the time he disappeared, but the order does not seem to have been complied with. Jesse's friends back home were able to use the geolocation data embedded in photos he had taken to help determine his movements. Using this information, as well as CCTV footage after a month in Peru, Elisa finally had an idea of Jesse's movements in Juarez. CCTV shows Jesse leaving his hostel at 4:30 a.m. and walking towards an area where people would gather to find communal transportation. It is unknown exactly who gave Jesse a ride, but he was dropped off at the Cacapampa entrance Huascarán National Park. There is no actual record of Jesse entering the park. Subsequent investigation would show that the individuals working at the park that day were not actual employees of the park, and the documents the park provided were both incomplete and forged. No one had actually been asked to sign in at the Cacapampa entrance to the park on the day Jesse entered it. When the park was asked for the records of who entered the park that day, they simply took the sheet from the same day in August and changed the date on it to September. They then presented the document to investigators. Hikers on the Santa Cruz Trek can travel in either direction along it, either going west to east or east to west. Jesse opted to travel west to east, starting in Cacapampa. He had already purchased a ticket to take the bus in Vaquillera at the other end of the trek. While Jesse's intentions for his hike were clear, it would be several months before anyone would be able to confirm that Jesse had ever actually made it onto the trail. Elisa had hired a US-based private security firm the same day she had reported Jesse missing, and they sent a subcontractor from Mexico City to help her search for Jesse when she first arrived in Peru. According to Elisa, the authorities in Peru did not have the resources to perform the search, which left the task up to her and the private firm. She has also claimed that the Peruvian authorities are highly corrupt, a fact which has compromised her own efforts to find Jesse. The early effort to find Jesse mainly consisted of physical searches in the mountains. Elisa hired teams to search the trails and nearby bodies of water. She was eventually able to get helicopters to search the area for 4 days. Elisa also hired local guides to perform glacier searches and bring in search dogs. After a month with no sign of Jesse, however, Elisa had to change her approach. In November, Elisa hired a new firm, Magnus International Search and Rescue, out of Israel, for the next stage of the search for her son. Magnus has performed additional physical searches along the trail. They have searched waterways using a remote-operated vehicle, flown drones over the trail looking for disturbances in the soil, and spent hundreds of man-hours in the mountains and along the trail, finding nothing despite all of these efforts. However, the firm has made great strides on the intelligence side of the investigation using technology. Magnus scanned photographs uploaded to social media sites such as Facebook and Instagram to identify photos that had been taken on the trail at the same time Jesse had been there. They then reached out to and interviewed all of the individuals who had posted these pictures. In January 2018, they found 2 witnesses who could place Jesse on the trail. 2 Frenchmen who were on the trek, camped next to Jesse on the night of September 30th. They said that at that time, Jesse was dehydrated and disoriented, suffering from headaches and diarrhea. They believed that Jesse was suffering from altitude sickness, a condition that can occur in individuals who ascend to altitudes as low as 2,500 meters, depending on the environments their bodies are acclimated to. Most people who suffer from altitude sickness only experience a mild form of it, but the severe form of altitude sickness, which typically occurs at higher altitudes, and in people who are ascending quickly, can result in coma and death due to pulmonary and cerebral edema. According to the French witnesses, Jesse told them that he was feeling better when he woke up on the following morning, October 1st. He looked much better as well, and he seemed to have all of the equipment he would need to complete the trek, so the witnesses were not necessarily concerned when Jesse decided to continue on his hike. They did not stay with him on the trek, because they were traveling it in the opposite direction. Other hikers eventually tracked down by Magnus International remembered seeing Jesse later in the day on October 1st because he looked so ill and was walking so slowly. As far as Magnus has been able to determine, Jesse was last seen at 3:30 p.m. on October 1st by a group of Czech backpackers. Jesse was sitting on the side of the trail approximately 1 kilometer down from Punta Union, struggling to stand up. It had taken him 8 hours to cover a distance his mother, who was not experienced with either hiking or high altitudes, but was taking medication to combat altitude sickness and working with a guide, covered in 2 hours when she came to hike the trail during her search for Jesse. Jesse asked the group about where he could get water. This is the last known interaction Jesse had with anyone. No sign of him or any of his belongings has ever been found. The Santa Cruz trek starts out at 3,400 meters and is 4,700 meters at its highest point. The highest point on the trek is at Punta Union, near where Jesse was last seen. Jesse had not spent an extended period of time in Juarez, which is at approximately 3,000 meters, before beginning the trek, which would have helped his body acclimate to being at a higher altitude. Lima, where he had spent the previous few days, sits at only 154 meters. Working with a guide would have helped prevent Jesse from wandering off the trail, but also may have put less physical stress on his body. Many of the local guides also drive mules up the mountain to carry hikers' backpacks. Carrying his own heavy backpack while his body was struggling to adapt to the altitude would have placed additional stress on Jesse's body and potentially made his altitude sickness worse. The fact that Jesse's condition appeared to be at its worst near the highest point of the trail seems to support the French witnesses' concerns that he was battling altitude sickness. The Santa Cruz trek is classified as a moderate trail, a distinction that Jesse's mother has been highly critical of. Elisa argues that this classification does not convey the difficulty of the terrain or the impact altitude has on the effort involved in hiking the trail. The trail is also not well marked, and Elisa has said that she would not have successfully navigated it had she not had a guide with her. Jesse was an experienced hiker, but not necessarily prepared for what hiking this particular trail would entail. Jesse's parents divorced when he and his sister were very young. While his mother has been largely the public face of the search for Jesse and the main contact for Magnus International, Jesse's father, Todd Galganoff, has also worked extensively to find his son himself. Todd spent 9.5 months in Peru looking for Jesse before returning home in October of 2018. While Elisa believed Jesse had been abducted early on in the investigation into his disappearance, she now believes it is most likely that Jesse succumbed to complications from altitude sickness based on the account given by the French hikers who camped with him. Todd, on the other hand, still fears that Jesse may have been abducted to be used for forced labor. The initial reward for information that led to Jesse was $10,000 and was eventually raised to $30,000. Todd Galganov raised the amount being offered to $500,000. All of these amounts are in US dollars. According to Todd, if his son is being used for labor, it is most likely by a group of people engaged in illegal activities. And such people would only respond to giant sums of money because of how valuable Jesse would be as a free worker. He also says that he is not looking to prosecute anyone who may have abducted his son and will essentially pay the amount as ransom if it brings back Jesse. The search for Jesse has cost over $2 million to date. Elisa Clayman liquidated her financial assets and heavily mortgaged her home to cover some of these costs. But most of this money has come from contributions to Jesse's fund managed by the Missing Children's Network. Some of these contributions have been private donations and some have been the result of fundraising efforts organized by Jesse's family. In March of 2019, Elisa Clayman organized a bazaar in Montreal. where she and volunteers sold donated items and hosted raffles. The event raised over $12,000 for the search fund. Elisa Kleeman is also working to prevent other families from going through what her family has experienced. She is currently filing a civil lawsuit against Huascaran National Park for negligence and forgery, and hopes to make the park safer for future hikers who wish to complete the trek. She also has plans to help develop tracking devices that could be used to locate children who go missing. While Elisa Kleeman believes Jesse has passed away and her fight is to locate his body and bring him home, and Todd Galganov still believes there's a chance Jesse is alive and needs to be rescued. They both continue to fight for answers about what happened to their son. What do you think about it? Tell us your thoughts in comments below. Let's continue. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the depths of unsolved mysteries. Cold cases not only challenge our understanding of the past, but also ignite our curiosity and determination for answers. Remember to subscribe to stay updated on our latest investigations. And if you have any information regarding the cases we've covered, don't hesitate to reach out. Together, we can shed light on the shadows of the past and bring closure to those who seek it. Until next time, stay vigilant, stay curious, and never stop seeking the truth.